A lot of mention has been made of the tweets from the West Bank that came to us as we were getting tear gassed in Ferguson. Those mattered. It all mattered. That produced a different level of intensity and solidarity that didn't just lead us to talk about Palestine more. It led us to take delegation to Palestine. I was part of the Ferguson to Palestine delegation in January of 2015. It changed my life. It changed my professional trajectory. It changed my research agenda. It sharpened my politics. And it made me think about this question of liberation and justice and self-determination in radically new and more expansive ways.
What the demand of Palestinian recognition of Israel's right to exist is saying, and is demanding of Palestinians, is Israel saying, we want you to acknowledge that we had the right to dispossess you. They're saying that this was the right thing to do, that we were in the right in doing so. How can anyone expect that demand to be accepted?
Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. Earlier this year, Mondoweiss contributing writer Sarah Doyal reviewed the new book, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, from authors Marc Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. Sarah wrote, delving into the phenomenon long named in leftist circles as, quote, progressive except for Palestine, end quote, Hill and Plitnick meticulously deconstruct progressives' neglect of the Palestinian cause. They explain the ways in which the singular exception of Palestine from demands for equal rights betrays not only Palestinians, but the progressive movement itself. She went on to say, Except for Palestine is a crucial and ultimately hopeful tool that better equips progressives to combat injustices within their own political circles. On today's show, Josh Ruebner speaks with Marc Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick about their important new book. Josh is the author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and he is an adjunct professor of Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University.
Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your guest host, Josh Ruebner, and I'm really thrilled to welcome the co-authors of a very important new book just published by the New Press, entitled Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. Marc Lamont Hill is an award-winning journalist and the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University. He's the author of many books, including the New York Times bestseller Nobody, which I have on my shelf. It's an excellent book, really rises to the occasion of explaining the background to the real need to move forward the Black Lives Matter movement. We're also joined by Mitchell Plitnick, who is the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and a frequent analyst and commentator on Middle East policy. In the past, he's worked as the vice president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, director of the U.S. Office of the Israeli Human Rights Organization B'Tselem, and a co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. Marc and Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us on the Mondoweiss podcast today.
It's a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
So before we get into some of the really crucial issues that you raised in your book, I wanted to ask both of you something that you didn't address in the book. Since neither of you are Palestinian, I wanted to ask each of you about your journey on the issue of Palestine. How'd you become aware of this issue of Palestine, and what did you experience or learn, or possibly even have to unlearn in order to incorporate advocacy for Palestinian rights into your broader progressive politics? Mitchell, I wanted to start with you.
There was a good deal of unlearning. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew in New York City in a very radically pro-Israel environment. Not even standard. Just I tell people I met Mayor Kahana when I was 11 at a friend's house on one Shabbat. So that. While that wasn't entirely typical of the atmosphere around me all the time, but it was a good part of it. I was given a narrative about Israel where Israel was always right, always the innocent victim, And that doesn't play well, I think, for trying to convince people, because by the time I was, I was still in the single digits of years, that didn't make much sense to me. Is just nobody's ever that much in the right. And I was studying for many, many years, learning mostly at the beginning, mostly from Zionist historians and analysts, but who were already problematizing the narrative that I had been brought up with. Progressing over the years, it was a long time before I really got active in this movement, though. I joined Jewish Voice for Peace. That was really the start of it for me in the late 90s. So I was already in my 30s when I brought this in, and it's obviously, it's got personal importance to me. I know many people in Israel, and at the time I did not know many Palestinians, but I do now. So, and many of these are friends, even family. So there's personal importance, but there's also a sense that this particular issue, since foreign policy is what I've always been drawn to in many regards, this particular issue, I think, offers not only the most vexing and complicated problem in a lot of ways in terms of entrenched U.S. policy that's having a real negative effect, but also I think if we can resolve this, and that's a big if, of course, just in terms of U.S. policy, it would make an enormous difference in all sorts of American foreign policies. So once I decided to get active in this, I pretty much dove in to Jewish Voice for Peace and helped to build it from a local Bay Area organization into the national organization, very powerful one that it is now. Something I'm really proud of, and also, Josh, where I met you. That part of the journey, I think, was very, very important to me. I've sort of gone back and forth into how much I'm doing this in terms of the Jewish community. My focus is really on U.S. foreign policy. I don't think there's much doubt that Israel has had a profound impact on Jews all over the world, whether you are supportive of Israel, supportive of Palestinian rights, even if you're not all that interested in the issue, it still had a profound impact. And, in my view, it has not necessarily been a very good one. So there is also that personal investment in trying to reset the Jewish community to sort of a place where Israel is not how we primarily identify ourselves as Jews.
Thanks, Mitchell. How about you, Mark?
I first came across these issues and these questions as a young activist and as a young scholar. I was a teen activist, and I was very much interested in the Black radical tradition. And as I encountered the Black radical tradition, it was impossible not to discover and think about the question of Israel and Palestine. Of course, when you study early Black thinkers of the 20th century, so many were committed to the Zionist project, or at least affirming the Zionist project as a way of believing that oppressed groups, ethnic minorities, racialized groups like Black folk in America, et cetera, could create a space of peace, safety, justice, and self-determination for themselves. And so for them, people like Marcus Garvey and to some extent W.E.B. Du Bois early on saw the early issue as a kind of site of possibility. And so I read that and I was very interested in that. I watched with great admiration the marches on Washington and people sitting at the Pettus Bridge, and of course, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, right? I mean, when you think about the kind of solidarity between Blacks and Jews and in the United States around this question of civil rights and human rights, I was very acquainted with the tradition. Like Mitchell, the more I studied, the more I encountered other voices and other perspectives, the more my point of view became more nuanced, as did the Black radical tradition. My entry point was Malcolm X. It remains Malcolm X. Everything else, it was Malcolm, then I went back. Then it was Malcolm, and I moved forward. But it was Malcolm. That was my symbol. That was my sign. That was my guide. And so when I read Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, my life changed. I haven't been the same since. And I wanted to do what Malcolm did and study what Malcolm studied. I wanted to be Malcolm. And I watched Malcolm travel to Africa and the Middle East. When I say watch, I mean, of course, through his writings. I saw that Malcolm made a decision to write an essay in September of 64 in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic. After he'd been to Gaza, he'd been to, he'd seen pre-1967 war what had happened. Martin Luther King, died in 68. And before and in June of 67, he made a decision not to return for another trip to the quote unquote Holy Land because he didn't want to reinforce certain things that he no longer believed in, or that he never believed in. He raised questions around East Jerusalem. He raised all sorts of issues. King was shifting. SNCC wrote a letter after an important newsletter after the 1967 war, talking about neocolonialism. All of these writings, all of these things shaped my understanding of the struggle. Remember, I'm a young man coming of age in the 90s. I'm an activist in the 90s. I'm growing as an intellectual in the 2000s. And in those eras, I have access to all these documents. So I'm watching the kind of full sweep of history from Du Bois forward. And I'm saying, oh, there's something here that's more complicated than two-state solutions and rights to exist. And it's a bad neighborhood. And these people have always been, all the kinds of rhetoric, all the language, all the perspectives. I knew that there was more to it. And so I read more and more. I'd always been fascinated with the Middle East, at least since Malcolm. But I needed to read more. Fast forward, I'm a journalist and an academic in the 2000s, in those aughts, and what am I doing? I'm watching Operation Cast Lead. I'm watching Protective Edge. I'm witnessing what's happening in Gaza before and after the election of Hamas. And so I'm developing a sensibility around this based on what I'm watching on the ground as a journalist, which is shifting my perspective a bit or crystallizing my perspective a bit. Well, as a CNN commentator, I was debating Alan Dershowitz, which is a very intense and provocative exercise for anyone who undertakes such a project. And so all of these experiences, all of these factors helped me understand and made me more invested in studying and talking about the issue. And then finally, I was on the ground in Ferguson, right? Protective Edge is happening in July. Mike Brown gets killed in August. And we're struggling and we're talking and we're communicating. A lot of mention has been made of the tweets from the West Bank that came to us as we were getting tear gassed in Ferguson. Those mattered. It all mattered. That produced a different level of intensity and solidarity that didn't just lead us to talk about Palestine more. It led us to take delegation to Palestine. I was part of the Ferguson to Palestine delegation in January of 2015. It changed my life. It changed my professional trajectory. It changed my research agenda. It sharpened my politics. And it made me think about this question of liberation and justice and self-determination in radically new and more expansive ways. And since then, I've been pushing and fighting and advocating and trying to stand in solidarity with Palestinian people, despite, as you point out, the fact that I'm not one and don't pretend to be one. I don't play one on TV. I just try to be an advocate and an ally and stand in solidarity.
Thank you so much, both of you, for indulging me in opening up and sharing some of those personal anecdotes on your journeys. And the reason why I wanted to open up on a personal note, and I suspect that this is part of the reason why you wrote this book, is because you believe that people's awareness and journeys toward a more progressive politics is something not only possible, but something that's necessary in order to move
Absolutely.
our country's policies in a fundamental way. So thank you very much for that. So let me jump into the actual book. In the introduction of the book, you have a very pessimistic take on the potential policies of the Biden administration, and I think for good reason. So we've only been in the Biden term for about 2 months now or so. But could you provide us an initial assessment of the Biden administration's policies based on your predictions in the book?
Well, I think the first place I go with that is just contrasting Biden's foreign policy in general with his domestic policy. I mean, I think we as progressives need to acknowledge that we've had, and I don't think we have to give Biden all the credit in the world here. I think we need to acknowledge that we've had an effect. That we've helped get people like Bernie Sanders, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, now like Jamal Bowman, Mondo Jones, Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. We've gotten these people into office and into places where they can start making a difference. And I think we're seeing the results of that in domestic policy. I recently wrote a critique of the big COVID relief bill, $1.9 trillion. It is something that should have been done a long time ago. And I'm not saying it should not have been done, but it is nothing more than a stopgap measure, but more permanent steps forward are on the table and are at least possible or at least conceivable now. But in foreign policy, we don't see anything like that in general. And I think, the fact is the worst, I think, example of that right now is the fact that Biden seems to be letting the Iran deal die. And despite his promises and rhetoric about getting back into it, he has allowed himself to be pushed not only by Republicans, but by the hawks in his own party to slow walking that process at best. While leaving in place all the additional sanctions during a pandemic that Trump imposed. This is bad news. It at least is a matter of some discussion. When it comes to the question of Palestine, Biden's performance so far has been everything I expected, which is terrible. He has reinforced Trump's opposition to the ICC investigation. I am pessimistic about that investigation, even if it is allowed to go forward. But the fact of it happening is still important. Even if it ends up with with the negative outcome, I feel like just bringing it up and every time Israel is investigated, at least there's an attempt to hold it to account for its crimes. And again, no one's singling, despite the arguments, no one's singling out Israel. In fact, the opposite. The attempt here is to hold Israel to the same standards as every other state. And that's actually what Israel and its supporters doesn't like. So, there's that. It was very nice that earlier this week, Biden announced $15 million in aid to Palestinians. And I grant, and I do understand that congressional actions over the past number of years, Taylor Force Act and other things that have been passed in Congress make it difficult, more difficult than just than it might otherwise be in other circumstances to restore all of the even the status quo, which was nowhere near adequate before Trump. But they can be done. It's not. While it may be more difficult than usual, it's certainly doable, and it's not a Herculean task. So $15 million going to Palestinians right now is a drop in the ocean of what's needed. But that's fine. That is one good thing. But the ongoing essentially, tacit approval of Trump's recognition of Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, the tacit approval of Trump's move of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which we go into quite a bit in our book. The fact that even during the campaign, Biden stated he is not going to reverse that. The fact that, what he seems to be, and I think this is really the key point, what Biden and Tony Blinken seem to be aiming at is to get us back to where we were before Trump, which is a failed peace process aiming at a two-state solution that is, that even if you still support the concept of a two-state solution, the one that was envisioned by the Oslo process is clearly and demonstrably unviable. It is not possible. And in a sense, he is trying to get us back to a place of where the Palestinians and Israelis are negotiating and talking. Settlements continue to expand. The occupation continues to tighten. Palestinians are more and more dispossessed, and that becomes the new normal. And I think he's also, part of that is also the unquestioning applause that has greeted the so-called Abraham Accords, where, and I certainly understand Biden's not going to say it's a bad thing. And I don't expect any American politician to say it's a bad thing that Israel has normalized relations with Arab states. But the way that went about, the briberies and blackmail that Trump used should have been addressed by Biden right away, and it should have been brought to the fore that these agreements cannot block relief for the Palestinians and the bottom line, granting of Palestinian rights that Israel has the capability and power to deny, but not the right to do so. So Biden's done none of that. He has indicated he's not going to do any of that. He's trying to get back to a modified version of where we were before Trump. And that was a disaster. It is so easy now to look at Trump and say, oh, well, we just need to get rid of everything he has done and get back to where we were before. But where we were before in 2016 was horrible. It was, without a doubt, Barack Obama's greatest foreign policy failure was Israel-Palestine. The situation was far worse than it was when Obama took office. The goal to get back to that is an absurd one all around.
Well, yeah, clearly getting back to the status quo is not adequate. And Mark, to follow up on the question, not only has the Biden administration done all the things that Mitchell just mentioned, but Biden's ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, called BDS borderline anti-Semitic in her confirmation hearings. The Biden administration has embraced and championed, in their words, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's very problematic definition of anti-Semitism, which cracks down on so much free speech related to Palestinian rights. So what can progressives do to push back against this very problematic framework? And can and should we expect better from the Biden administration?
Expect? No. Demand? Absolutely. Mitchell lays out quite brilliantly the trajectory of the Biden administration's policies on this. They'd much rather do nothing than advocate a position in defense of Palestinians. Would the Biden administration have moved the embassy? No. No U.S. president has not signed the waiver of the Jerusalem Embassy Act that's been around since 1995, except Trump. It's reasonable to say that area now known as Ramat Trump in the Golan would. I know it makes you. It makes your skin crawl just a little bit to hear it, but when you think about that area, it's unlikely that would have happened under Biden, but it's happened, and Biden does nothing. And so what we understand then is that the Biden administration will be less likely to advance certain policy agendas, but they'll do nothing to stop it. That tells you everything you need to know about the Biden administration and its commitment to this issue. So what we have to do as activists, as policymakers, as scholars, whatever your role is in this, is actively push back and demand more from the Biden administration. We have to actively make this a campaign issue. One of the things that happened in 2016, as the Democratic Party was rewriting its platform, was powerful voices like Cornel West and others who stood up and said, "Hey, no, we have to use the language of occupation. We got to be honest about that." At the current moment, we have to push back both in the public sphere, the counter-public sphere, the private sphere, against these attempts to criminalize any type of dissent. When Facebook is considering, using or not allowing users to use the word Zionist itself in ways that open up conversations for critique, for pushback, for debate, etc. But instead make it seem as if anyone who's critical of Zionism is by definition anti-Semitic. That kind of move is dangerous. It's dangerous that a corporation is doing that, but this isn't Hobby Lobby. This isn't Chick-fil-A. This is another level, right? These are corporations and platforms that actually shape how we engage the world, right? They're not entities playing on the landscape. In many ways, they are the landscape. And so, and we can have a whole conversation about what it means for big tech companies to have this much control over our lives, our media, our communication, and our politics. But nonetheless, if we can't go on social media and critique positions that are different than the mainstream, but that are within bounds in terms of being humane, just, anti-racist, etc., then we have a problem. There has to be room for dissent. And oftentimes, the very people railing against cancel culture are also willing to cancel anyone who's critical of Zionism, anyone who's critical of the Israeli policy. We know there's anti-Semitic people out there, and we must stop anti-Semitism. We must fight against anti-Semitism. We must rail against anti-Semitism at all times. At the same time that we do that, we must be willing to have a principled and critical conversation about the state of Israel. And at this moment, that means demanding that Facebook do something different because they won't do it on their own. It also means not allowing the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, which is so expansive that it not only captures very real and legitimate forms of anti-Semitism, but also makes it almost impossible to have a critique of Israel. We have to not allow that to become the normative definition in our spaces, whether it's in our schools, whether it's in our media, etc. When politicians call BDS either anti-Semitic or borderline anti-Semitic, we have to be willing to push back with data, with evidence, with history, to say, no, this is a principled nonviolent boycott and a means of resistance that should be welcomed by the international community, right? Rather than critiqued or dismissed as an improper way of resisting policies that we don't like. So for me, that's what it's about. It's about not waiting or expecting the Biden administration to do anything. It's about not being disappointed, because disappointment, again, reflects an expectation. But instead saying, we know exactly who the Biden administration is. We know exactly how they move on this issue, just like we understood how Obama moved, how Trump moved, et cetera. And given what we have at our disposal, we have to be willing to make a principled and thoughtful pushback and critique.
That's absolutely right. And on that line, something that I really enjoyed and appreciated about your book was the chapter that dealt with the question of Israel's right to exist, quote unquote. And one thing that was new for me in this book that I hadn't realized before, that this framing that Israeli propaganda uses about their right to exist is actually somewhat of a recent phenomenon. And that you had veteran Israeli diplomats like Abba Eban in the early days who were pushing back against the use of this framing. So I'm wondering if both of you can kind of walk us through this process about how this went from something that wasn't part of the Israeli lexicon into the really central role that the quote unquote right to exist debate has within Israeli Hasbara right now.
No, it's a great question. And it's one of the things, it's not only like the first chapter, but it's one of the first issues that Mitchell and I talked through and worked through and wrote and rewrote, and because we wanted to get this right, because there's an important argument here. But we also obviously don't want that argument to be conflated with an argument in support of any type of animus or violence or dismissal of the very legitimate right for all people. But right now I'm speaking specifically of Israelis and of Jewish people around the world to live, again, with safety, peace, dignity, and self-determination. Because oftentimes when the question is asked, does Israel have a right to exist? What many people hear is, do Israelis have a right to exist? Do Jews have a right to exist? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. And it's an important point that we want to make throughout the book, because in an anti-Semitic world, that can't be taken for granted. The question, though, in many ways is, first of all, do states have a right to exist? Right? People do, sure. Do states? States have a right to have their sovereignty honored and respected, right? Their territorial integrity protected and defended and affirmed. That's what it means to be a nation state. And Israel should have the same rights as every other nation in that way. That's not in question. So then, and I'll pass it to Mitchell in a second, so so we can continue to unpack this. But so the question, in many ways, becomes: why is this particular ask being made now? Why is it being asked of the particular people of whom it's being asked? And what political work does it do? Does this question do? Right? Does Israel have a right to exist, or do you affirm Israel's right to exist? Because Egypt isn't asked to do this. Jordan isn't asked to do this. It wasn't asked to do that, to not get in the weeds. I mean, Egypt wasn't asked to do that. Jordan's not asked to do that. We don't run around affirming the right of the United States to exist, or Iran to exist, or Mexico to exist, or Canada to exist. And so if we don't make that ask of everybody, if all nations don't make that demand, and if Israel's not even making that demand of all the nations, not even the nations with whom it's had war with, right? Which is why I mentioned Egypt, Jordan. We could make the same case for Syria, Lebanon. Egypt, to be sure, Syria, Jordan. Then the question becomes: why is this demand being made of Palestinians? And finally, for me, because there's still much more to be said, when I say what political work does it serve, I'm pointing to the very particular ways that the acknowledgement of the right to exist has been used as the pretext for breaking down negotiations, for not engaging Palestinians, for denying Palestinian representation at the table, or for calling them anti-Semites. And so, and you saw this with negotiations from the PLO, and you see what happens when Palestinians say, you know what, we do affirm Israel's right to exist, either implicitly by acknowledging, the various UN resolutions, whether it's 242 or 338, whether it's through the speech, through the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, whether it's through Yasser Arafat's very well-regarded speech, I believe in 1988, around this issue, and whether it's the press conference he gives the day after the speech saying, just in case you thought I didn't say what you're saying I said, or no, in case they didn't, just in case you think I didn't say the thing that I said, here, let me say it explicitly. And it still doesn't lead to the kind of outcomes you would expect if that were really the point, right? I've sort of very unfairly to Mitchell teed up this big question of why. I've laid out the problem, but Mitchell could probably speak to the why. So why is this right to exist thing a thing?
And I think also, Marc, you're doing a really great job of teeing up the question of why explicitly do we have this newfangled Israeli demand, not only that Palestinians recognize Israel, but recognize it as a Jewish state, which is something you address in your book. So take it away, Mitch.
I think, stepping back a little bit, Zionism is obviously a hotly debated form of nationalism, and people identify as Zionist, anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, all sorts of these kind of questions and identifications. But there is one truth. I mean, there's a simple fact that Zionism created a nation, for better or worse. The fact that it created a nation, in my view, is the prerogative of any potential national group. Any potential national group can consolidate a national identity, national desires, and can press their case for that, whether or not that necessarily constitutes the right to a state. Okay, nations do not actually have a right to their own state. They have a right to national self-determination. That's been generally agreed in international discourse, that as some sense of national identity, national rights it can be within the state of that is not their own. We see this all over the world. We see this right here in the United States. We have a number of nations that exist within the United States without actually being sovereign over the United States. Right? These would be First Nations. This whole right to exist is a way of granting to Israel this notion that because it's a nation, it has a right to a state. Well, that's not necessarily true. It is certainly fair for Israel for the Zionist movement to have tried to get themselves a state, but there is certainly no right for them to have displaced and dispossessed another people in order to do that. And fundamentally, really, that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, that's the root of the entire conflict, is the dispossession by the Zionist movement of the Palestinian people. Which was done. Again, this has been done. Even though it is also ongoing, it has also been done. And there's no way to make that have not happened. So the question then becomes, what what is the utility of forcing Palestinians to acknowledge Israel's right, not only right to exist, but right to exist as a Jewish state? I mean, the goalposts have moved a few times. So as we, where we start in the book, we talk about Abiy. We also talk about Menachem Begin, who made, when he became prime minister, made a very dramatic speech to the Knesset saying how we will not ever ask anyone to acknowledge our right to exist. And he specifically drew the distinction between the right to exist and acknowledgement of sovereignty. These are two completely different things. Okay. Again, Iran, just to use another example, Iran does not demand of anyone, the United States or anyone else, whether, from the United States to Lebanon to Syria to Saudi Arabia, Iran never tells anyone that it has to recognize it as an Islamic republic. They want their sovereignty and their rights as a sovereign state recognized. That's it. That's what every other state, says. And again, Israel, look at the Abraham Accords, to go back to those. Israel does not make that demand of recognizing it as a Jewish state, of the United Arab Emirates, of Bahrain, right. None of that. It isn't there, even though, incidentally, Yasser Arafat actually did implicitly acknowledge and state, that there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state, much as the UN did in their partition plan. So, there is already that. But what is this? So what I'm driving at, what is this question fundamentally really about? It is not about whether Jews have the right to constitute ourselves as a nation. That's a question for Jews. Whether we want to constitute ourselves as a nation. I personally do not think that nationalism has served us well, but that is a question for Jews in terms of how we collectively identify. The issue comes in when that nation decides to do things to another group of people. Nation or otherwise. In this case, it is another nation, the Palestinian nation. And what the demand of Palestinian recognition of Israel's right to exist is saying, and is demanding of Palestinians, is Israel saying, we want you to acknowledge that we had the right to dispossess you. They're saying that this was the right thing to do, that we were in the right in doing so. How can anyone expect that demand to be accepted? One of the people we quote in the book on this issue, Yusuf Nair, said to demand that a Palestinian not be anti-Zionist is to demand that a Palestinian not be. I'm not sure if I have the exact word in there, but that's basically what he said. And I think that's not only correct, but it's very poignant. And it's very much to the point. What Israel is saying is that Palestinians have to acknowledge that they never should have been in Palestine, and that the Zionist movement had every right to come there and to essentially remove them from Palestine, or at the very least, even if we want to accept the argument that they never intended for the refugees to leave, which is clearly not true, but let's just accept it for a second. Even if we accept that, the clear and unquestionable motivation was to create a country where the Jews ruled over them, to whatever degree that was going to be. Even in the most positive formulation of that, Jabotinsky, who we again cite, envisioned a sort of power sharing arrangement, but it was a power sharing arrangement, and he was very clear about this, with the Jews on top. He felt that would still be beneficial to Palestinians. Fine, whatever. There's a lot of racism involved there, but that, even at that, every single formulation of Israel in relation to the Palestinians has the Jews ruling over Palestinians. As our mutual friend Noura Erakat has said on numerous occasions, the problem is not coexistence. It is not having Jews in Palestine. The problem is that the Jews want to rule over the non-Jews in Palestine, in Israel. And that is what we're rallying against. Look, there is no possibility. I don't know anyone who thinks there is a possibility of Israel just ceasing to exist, and of the millions of Jews who are there simply departing in anything other than some apocalyptic war. And I don't know anyone who wants to see that happen. There's going to have to be some way forward. But what I think most people object to is the idea that Jews have more rights than Palestinians within this context. And however, if a situation of equal rights is such that people are uncomfortable with that, well, that's what politics is all about. You change it. People right now don't like many Jews, Israel likes to talk about how many European Jews have moved there in recent years, but also many Israelis have left. We have, and that's because they don't like the situation there, or they want to live somewhere else, whatever that might be. They're free to do that, or free to stay and have to be. Again, nobody is talking about infringing on and taking away rights. We are talking about eliminating privileges that subjugate others. I mean, it's the same fight, really, that we're having right here and all over the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's ridiculous that people frame human rights as a zero-sum game. I mean, it's a positive-sum game. I want to switch gears here for a minute. You do a really great job in your book of explaining why progressives should support Palestinian rights. But what I wanted you to address a little bit, which you actually, I don't think covered all that much in your book, was why you think it's the case that there's been this progressive exception for Palestine.
It's a good question. And I think part of what we try to do in the book is show the kind of political decisions that are made that have allowed Palestine, the exception of Palestine. In really ways, Israel becomes an exception, right, in terms of its treatment that then leads to a kind of exceptionalized disregard of Palestinian rights, or an exceptionalized disregard of Palestinian freedom, self-determination, etc. What we see is a few things. One is that the status quo is always easier. The status quo is easier. Joe Biden probably does not lose sleep at night thinking about the Jerusalem embassy. But I suspect that if he were asked sincerely what he thinks about it, he probably would have preferred for it to remain in Tel Aviv. And he probably would have wanted that to be a final status question. But it's much safer politically to say nothing and say, look, it's already done. Wasn't me. That was Trump. Nothing we can do about it. Than to actually fight and advocate for that position. Which brings me to my second point, right? Which is that, because the question would be why, right? If it's the right thing to do, why go with the easier way? We do uphill fights for all kinds of stuff, universal health care, gay marriage, etc., or marriage equality, excuse me. Why would we make this the thing? Well, it's because Palestinians and Arabs more broadly are often seen as disposable. If we have the idea that, Arabs are uncivilized and barbaric and they fight each other all the time and they've been doing this for centuries and no amount of U.S. intervention will change anything, and we construct them in this way, then it's very easy to say, well, who cares? It's just more brown people dying. It's more brown people catching hell. Brown people catch hell. It's what happens. In the same way that when we see a news story about Chicago shootings where 50 people die over a weekend, we don't have the same intuitive outrage that we do if 8 people die or 10 people die in Boulder, or, and it's not an explicit thing. It's sort of how we've been taught culturally and socially to be wired around issues of difference. And there's the fact that, supporting Israel in a two-state solution, however impossible that particular vision is at this juncture in history, it's like kissing a baby. So there's that, right? It's just easy to do. You'll never lose any votes for it. You'll never have any controversy if you say, I support two-state solutions. The status quo. It's the norm. But then there's also an outright animus, I think, toward brown folk that make that decision that allows people to not lose too much sleep over it. And then finally, I would also say what it's not. Because I think at a moment, again, of rising anti-Semitism, both in the United States and in Europe and really around the world, it's very easy for people to fall into these ugly and untrue anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around Jewish cabals of power and secret networks and Jewish money and all these things, which are not true. They're simply not true. They're flat out untrue anti-Semitic lies. What is true is that people have effectively lobbied for Israel. Israel has an effective lobby. The NRA has an effective lobby. Lots of people have effective lobbies. The question is, for me, is not how do we prevent Jewish lobbies from existing. Israel has, or in Israeli lobbies from existing. because Jewish lobbies, Israeli lobbies have a right to exist and a right to function just like every other lobby. It's what's supposed to happen. I have no issue with them, their existence or their work. The question is, how do people with a different point of view organize and garner the resources necessary to make their vision of the world also intervene in the public discourse?
I would want to sort of build on that. First of all, historically, I think one of the places that we start from is that support for Israel in this country is built on decades, many, many decades. And it starts all the way back even in the pre-state days. And I'm talking about on the left here, where Israel was seen as a socialist paradise. Right. It was seen as the triumph of the workers. Part of the reason for that is that in the Western discourse, very little attention was paid. I mean, people did talk about the refugee problem in those days. But first of all, there was no sense of a sort of a national conflict at that time, even though it existed, but it wasn't present in the Western discourse. There and it just wasn't that big a part of the story. I think for a lot of people, they thought, okay, a war happened, people got displaced, that'll get settled, and then we'll move on. But look at this great socialist paradise that was created in the state of Israel. As we know, of course, it hasn't exactly worked out that way. But that I think was the beginning. And then, once that started to fade, I think in the early 60s, that was when you had the sort of the Exodus myth, right? Paul Newman and playing, the heroic Israeli soldier. That took hold, I think, very powerfully. And in the 67 war, when Israel beat back all these, all the countries, and by that time you have the Cold War, where Israel had by then become a close U.S. ally, whereas Egypt and Syria largely had moved more towards the Soviet sphere. You had the Cold War dynamics at play. All of this just built up an identification in the United States, with Israel as not just an ally, but as a almost as a brother country, a sister country, I guess we would say. At that point, that was after the 67 war is when you really started seeing the pro-Israel lobby become powerful. But it didn't create the policies. What it did was reinforce them, and has been doing so ever since. And look, I don't think there is a single lobby on any issue that is more effective in terms of dollar for dollar resources than the Israel lobby. They are really good at what they do, and that should be acknowledged. Part of the reason they're so good at what they do is that they have no effective opposition. This is a place where advocates of Palestinian rights have ceded ground for so long that now to try and build a countervailing force it really is a very difficult task that will take an awful lot of resources just to get started. So I understand why, the longer it goes, the more that is true. And I think it's that imbalance more than anything else that causes AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbies like Kufi, which in many ways, certainly among Republicans is far more powerful than AIPAC. That's the key to their success. They really don't have significant opposition. But ultimately, policy, especially foreign policy in this country, is actually based more on interest than it is on lobbying. I wrote a piece some years back for the Middle East Research and Information Project that goes into this and how that got developed. It's kind of an in-depth piece, but the bottom line is Israel serves our interests. It does not necessarily serve progressive interests. It may run counter to many of the goals of people listening to this podcast. But in terms of the planners of U.S. foreign policy, whether it's intelligence, whether it's through the military, whether just generally geostrategic interests are Israel serves a lot of that. And the fact is that, yes, a lot of it comes because of the international support Israel gets, but it is certainly not untrue that Israel has made huge contributions in sciences and technology and to the global economy. that are disproportionate to its size. So those are all things that are valued, not just in the United States, but in Europe, and yes, in the Arab in the Arab League meetings. I don't want to say in the Arab world, because again, most people are in the Arab world still support the Palestinian cause. The leadership, however, is who makes the deals. These are all reasons. And then you look at the Palestinians. Palestinians, have none of that going for them, right? They offer none of that. Even if they won everything that they would like to win, the possibility of them developing that sort of global influence are remote. They would take a long time. And worst of all, the Palestinians, should they actually gain their liberation, are a threat to many of our allies. I mean, imagine people in Saudi Arabia looking at the Palestinians winning. What would they feel about that? Would they not, draw some inspiration from Palestinians triumphing after a very long struggle? People all over the world who are living under very brutal conditions, who are, or even people in, right here in the United States who are living under oppression. That whole spectrum of oppressed people all around the globe would be inspired by Palestinians winning. So there is actually an incentive in the United States and in Europe and among the Arab leadership to not see the Palestinians attain their full freedom and rights. So, I mean, all of these reasons, are why this sort of support for Palestinians comes in. And as you might have noted in our book, a lot of what we're talking about with the Progressive Except for Palestine is not left-wing activists, although we do talk about that as well, because it does exist among just progressive activists. But we're really talking about the political left in power. So we're talking a lot about the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party on this, the things that I just described as to why Palestinian victory is not necessarily a desired thing, Democrats are just as hawkish on that point as Republicans. It is just as much a threat to their interest as to those of most Republicans, at least when we're talking about the real power in the Democratic Party, the centrists, the more conservative wings, which are still the base of power in that party. And what we're saying is this is, a lot of what we're trying to bring out in the book is that, that may be their goals, but it's not the values that they run for election on. And we're trying to sort of hold a mirror up to that and say, let's actually get Democrats that will live the values that they get elected for.
Yeah, thank you both for unpacking that in such a meaningful way. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to see if I could get your very quick reaction to one question. I want to share with our listeners some statistics from some recent public opinion surveys. A 2018 poll by Pew found that self-identified liberals, we're not even talking about progressives here, but liberals, sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israel by almost a 2-to-1 margin, 35 to 19%. A 2018 Brookings poll found that 56% of all Democrats, not only liberals, but all, favored sanctions or even stronger measures against Israel for its ongoing colonization of Palestinian land. And you may have seen that just this month, Gallup released a poll citing liberals favoring putting pressure on Israel more than Palestinians by a 53 to 22% margin. So I think that in the past few years, and even over the past decade or so, we have seen dramatic changes for the better in terms of how liberals and progressives in the US political sphere view this issue. So my concluding question to you is, what do we do to help translate that dynamism and growing support for Palestinian rights at the grassroots level up to policy change?
I think about those numbers. And of course, at the end of the book, we also offer some signs of hope by looking at poll numbers and also pointing to the election of some extraordinary folk, the Ilhan Omars of the world, the Rashida Tlaibs, as Mitchell mentioned. And also the fact that people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders may not have won the election, but their increasingly progressive stances on Palestine weren't the reasons why. I mean, this stuff all matters. And so that's a great starting place to know that we're moving in the right direction. But your question is not, are we moving in the right direction? Your question is, well, what do we do with that energy? I think that we have to organize, right? You only get what you organize for. And so the key right now is to continue to organize. Organize what? We need to organize to create political education. We need to organize to take that grassroots energy and that general sentiment that's moving in the right direction, and get people to vote for candidates that will affirm our perspectives in their respective offices. We need to organize that energy in our media representations. So that, part of what made this whole tide turn partly is people watching now, having access to what's happening in the West Bank, people seeing what happened during Protective Edge in 2014. People, that stuff all mattered. It all mattered. And so we have to have a very concerted, organized effort to educate folk on this, to vote properly, and to represent through our media, the way out.
And I would add that I think, at least in terms of Democrats, I think we are, these poll numbers, and they've been trending this way for many years. And I've written a number of articles about their existence, and I think we need to talk about them more. I think we need to make more and more people aware that, when they're saying this, they're not actually being radical within the Democratic Party. They're actually going along with the majority. They're actually being mainstream. But I think the biggest part of this, and this is why I think, getting back to what Marc talked about at the beginning, where he looked at talking about global solidarity and relating our foreign policy to what's happening here. To understand that we cannot ever win the civil rights battle here if we are at the same time supporting, massive atrocities in Yemen, pushing towards war with Iran, and yes, supporting the ongoing occupation and displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people. Those things cannot actually be separated. Yet, the fact is that when we look at those poll numbers, we can talk about, more than half of Democrats believing a certain thing, but how important is it when they vote? How important is it when they talk to their congressperson? Let's be honest, even among people who have an investment in Israel-Palestine, it's usually not number one or number two or number three. It's usually much lower on the list. So we need to, and it's not because they don't care about Israel-Palestine particularly, it's because Americans don't care about foreign policy in general. And that, I think, is something we need to address head on. We need to take that on really powerfully. Look, right now, when we, again, I bring it back to the fight that's happening in Congress with the Iran deal. The biggest impediment to the Biden administration moving forward on the Iran deal is, without a doubt, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, Bob Menendez. And what they're worried about is not just that Menendez won't like what they're doing. They're worried that Menendez will disrupt domestic issues, that he will work with the Joe Manchins and the Kirsten Cinemas to disrupt Biden's domestic agenda. That's what they're really worried about. And they don't want to, frankly, piss him off. So they're allowing him to be an obstruction. And Menendez on the issue of Palestine is at least as hawkish as he is on Iran. So we need the fact. So why does that happen? It happens because foreign policy is so deprioritized to American voters. And that's where we can make a difference. We're not going to change Bob Menendez's stance. We can change the views of his voters who would like to see something different, but it's just not that big a deal to them. We can make it a bigger deal. It's happened before. We've seen it happen before, where foreign policy issues, whether in South Africa or in Vietnam or in El Salvador, in many places where they have become issues. I'm a little bit older, and I was active in the 80s when Central America and when South Africa, when there were marches around these issues that were huge. Granted, I was in New York, so they were probably a little huger than in other places, but still, and it wasn't only in terms of American involvement of those things; it was about American support for them. So we can do that again, but we need to make those connections, and I think that's a place that we haven't been as strong as we can be. And I think That's why I think it is so crucial to draw, at this particular moment when we're trying to make substantive gains to end the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and we're seeing this massive backlash, but we're also seeing more and more people who are finally waking up and realizing, the Civil War didn't end. When we're seeing it, we need to make that connection to foreign policy. And I think it's possible to do it, but we have to get to work.
We definitely do. And I wish we could get into it more right now, but unfortunately we're out of time. Before we leave, Marc, can you tell us about Uncle Bobby's coffee and books and how our listeners can get a copy of Except for Palestine there?
Yeah, people can get a copy of Except for Palestine from Uncle Bobby's. You can go straight to our website, Uncle Bobby's. That's Uncle BOBBIES.com. That'll also take you to Bookshop, which is a great alternative to Amazon. If we want to, create space for independent bookstores and to challenge the unfair labor practices of the big box retailers and the online retailers, one of the things we can do is use bookshop.org. You can go there and type in Uncle Bobby's at your bookstore, and you can shop there. It'll all take you to the same place. And Uncle Bobby's is a labor of love. It's the bookstore that I created in 2017, named after my late uncle. And it's an opportunity for me to create something in our community in Philadelphia, but really around the world at this point, that is reflective of the deep connection that Black folk have to struggle, to ideas, to literacy. It's also just a really cool bookstore to hang out in. It's also, Mitchell and I did a lot of work for this book there, It's a great cafe. It's in Philadelphia, but of course people can support it internationally through bookshop.org. Our motto is cool people, dope books, and great coffee. Cool people, dope books, and great coffee. And
it actually is great coffee. He's not just saying that. It's true.
And it's something we took pride in. And so I'm very excited to be part of a tradition of Black bookstores, of independent booksellers, and of progressive and radical booksellers. We're trying to do all the above. And I'm proud of the work that we've done. And I'm excited to walk into the store every day and see Except for Palestine. Now, it has a front of the store placement. I'll say that might be a little bit of home cooking. But the fact that the book is there is because these are the issues we care about. And this is the work we want to do in the world. And so I'm just grateful to have that opportunity.
Well, I really want to encourage everyone to go to Uncle Bobby's, get yourself a copy of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. Marc Lamont Hill, Mitchell Plitnick, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for being a guest here on the Mondoweiss podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly email newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcasts, please consider becoming a donor by visiting mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.